1, 2. Final stream test. 1, 2, 3, 4.
All right, welcome. We're going to get started. Welcome everyone to our distinguished lecture series, Stopping North Korea, Protecting America and Our Allies. Our distinguished lecture series is a public event hosted once a month featuring important leaders covering a variety of different key issues. In light of the challenges we are facing in North Korea, we'll be hearing tonight from the great Rebeccah Heinrichs. Before we begin, yeah, we're excited. There you go. Before we begin, please stand and join us in the prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. Leading us today are 1776 scholars Ben Lindstrom and Courtney Rainier.
Please join me for a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you for yet another wonderful Colorado day that you bestowed upon us to enjoy. I thank you for our ability to gather together and increase our knowledge and wisdom pertaining to current events that affect our nation. I pray that you will be with the speaker tonight as she addresses this issue, and I pray that you will also give the leaders of this nation wisdom and knowledge as they strive to protect America and their allies. In your name I pray, amen.
Good evening, everybody. Go ahead and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The students that you just had up here were part of our 1776 Scholars Program, which is a program for our outstanding CCU students. We are mentoring America's next generation of leaders, patriots who have the intellectual curiosity, moral compass, and youthful energy to make a positive difference in this great nation. Our scholars benefit from political training, mentorship, and contact with prominent politicians and thought leaders. Their internship with us builds their professional experience and leads to outstanding job opportunities after college. So if you're interested, if you're a student here, you're interested in the 1776 Scholars Program, please connect with Jansen Request back there. Raise your hand, Jansen, or you can email 1776scholars@gmail.com. Well, during a recent UN speech, President Trump called Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man. And today, Kim Jong-un sent balloons. I'm not kidding you. This is true. He sent balloons over to South Korea, calling President Trump Mad Dog Trump. Well, I say if you're facing Mad Dog Trump and Mad Dog Mattis, it's best not to be the Little Rocket Man. Just this past weekend, Hillary Clinton said that Trump was being too tough on Iran and North Korea. Too tough. Well, you know, we care a lot about what Hillary Clinton thinks when it comes to foreign affairs, but to use her words, at this point, what difference does it make? You're not the president. Yes, that's right. We have a much better president. So tensions with Kim Jong-un and North Korea continue to rise. Our speaker tonight will explore the current missile tests, underground nuclear tests, and what this means for America and our allies. Rebeccah Heinrichs is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she provides research and commentary on a range of national security issues and specializes in nuclear deterrence, missile defense, and counter-proliferation. Her work has appeared in major newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Times, Investors Business Daily, as well as political journals such as Politico and The Hill. She is a frequent contributor on Fox News. Rebeccah served as an advisor on military matters and foreign policy to Representative Trent Franks, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and helped launch the Bipartisan Missile Defense Caucus. She has testified before Congress and has presented to numerous organizations, including the Aerospace Industries Association, the Reserve Officers Association, the National Defense Industrial Association, the Center for Strategic International Studies, and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. She holds a Master of Arts degree in National Security and Strategic Planning from the U.S. Naval War College. She also graduated with highest distinctions from its College of Naval Command and Staff, receiving the Director's Award for Academic Excellence. She received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Ashland University in Ohio and graduated from the Ashbrook Scholar Program. Rebeccah currently resides in Arlington, Virginia with her husband and their children. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rebeccah Heinrichs.
That's a lot of stuff I do and have done. But I'll tell you what, the hardest thing I do and the most important thing I do is the last thing that was mentioned, and that is being a mom to my 4 children. My youngest one is back there in the arms of Jeff's wife. That's Rosemary, and so she came along with me. Thank you all so much for being here. It's a late evening, and you're here because you care a lot about our country, because you are aware of the threats that face her, and you want to be informed. You want to help pass along the knowledge and wisdom that you have to the next generation, and there is no better thing that you could be doing. So thank you so much for that. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of lay it out for you because just like a sermon, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say, and I'm going to go ahead and say it, and then I'm going to tell you what I said. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about why I'm even in national security policy. Some people ask, well, why are you doing this? And how did you get started? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, and then so that's going to be my first little story, and then I'm going to go into another little story that kind of takes us back into history a little bit. And then I'm going to go into a couple of different themes. One of them is just what is going on in Washington with this new president we have, and how is he doing in terms of national security generally? What are the threats that he's trying to deal with? How did we get here? I am going to dwell a little bit more on North Korea because that's what we use to get you all here. So I'm going to talk about the North Korean threat, what's happening now. Colorado actually has a really special role to play in protecting the country against that threat. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to close out with what I think is our great mission then to handle all of this before us. So as I said, we have inherited an exceptional nation. Not, as President Obama said, exceptional in the way that every country thinks that their own country is exceptional. Truly, objectively, the United States of America is an exceptional nation. And the threats against her are real and many. So how did I get started in this field? I was a freshman in college at Ashland University in Ohio. I had just begun studying political science, and the particular program I was in focused on the American founding. So I was becoming more aware of what our country actually was founded on, what it means, what the Constitution does. Lincoln said that the Constitution is the frame that goes around the golden apples that is the Declaration of Independence. And that you can't possibly understand the Constitution if you don't understand the Declaration, and vice versa. So I was learning about what it was that our country means, how unusual it is, all of the thought and work and toil that went into it. And I had just had a class, a political science class, early in the morning, and I was walking back to my dormitory, and I walked into the lobby, and there on the big screen TV, our cleaning crew that cleaned our dormitory was all sort of huddled around the big screen. And a couple of my professors were standing there as well. And I entered in just in time to see the second plane hit the trade towers. And so I'm watching it happen, and everybody around the room had their hands over their mouths. And at the time, it wasn't clear what was happening, but then I heard somebody say, it's happening on purpose. Because when the first plane hit, everyone was kind of confused. Did the pilot go off track? Was this an accident? But when the second one hit, we knew that it was on purpose. I went upstairs after that. It was quiet in the lobby. I went upstairs, and there was a Russian student who was there studying at Ashland University, and she was panicking. And she came to me, and she was panicking because she thought that the United States was under attack, and she didn't know how far away Ashland University in Ohio was to New York City. She wasn't familiar with the geography. And so I remember I pulled down the atlas from my shelf, and I pulled out a map as she was crying, and I was showing her, look, we're so far away. We're not under attack. Of course, I didn't know that we were under attack and that there was another plane headed towards the Pentagon, and of course the field in Pennsylvania, which was not so far away from where we were. And so it was this sort of intersection for me of really understanding the American founding, understanding how precious and unique and exceptional the United States was, that happened at the same time that September 11th, 2001 happened. And so just as I was really becoming sure that I wanted to get into public policy, that I decided that I wanted to do something in national security and international relations. And so that's what motivated me. And then I had a series of things, including my graduate degree, et cetera, that brought me more. I went out to Washington, D.C. and worked for the Congress that took me down this path. But I want to tell a little bit of another story that goes back into history just a little bit. This is from the New York Herald, European edition, February 1st, 1917. Germany has played her last card and placed herself outside of all laws and far beyond the place of civilization by proclaiming her intention to pursue her submarine warfare to its extreme limits against neutral as well as belligerent shipping in her determination to starve the Allies and end the war. Germany's act is tantamount to war against the world. She has thrown off the mask and has shown a contemptuous indifference for America by revoking all her undertakings to that country with regard to her piracy campaign. What President Wilson will do is the question on all lips. Then on April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson went before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Germany. 2 days later, the U.S. Senate voted in support of the measure to declare war on Germany. Americans were now at war and on edge. In a little town in Ohio with little more than 1,000 inhabitants, neighbors gathered in the afternoon for a lunch and fellowship. Little 3-year-old Marjorie Taylor watched the men come in from work to enjoy lunch with their wives, and the conversation drifted to the war. One of the men remarked the Germans had made a grievous error in their aggression. The United States would end their conquest, but it would be bloody. The neighbors agreed solemnly. And then one voice protested. But, I love the Kaiser, the lady from across the street said with a thick German accent. The room fell silent. Then little Marjorie watched 2 of the men take the woman by her arms out the door, down to the town's gazebo where there was an American flag planted. And there in front of the neighbors, they urged her to pledge her allegiance to the United States and her flag. And she did. Little 3-year-old Marjorie Taylor, who watched this scene unfold, was my grandmother. The memory lasted. Try to imagine. Think about the NFL right now. Try to imagine that happening today. It's almost unfathomable. And I can't help but wonder if enough Americans today would have the character and the moral clarity and the love of country to fight and win a world war like that again. It's hard to picture. But you can understand the situation in the room when we were under attack and in a war like that. The fear of a lack of patriotism was real and what that meant. Now, consider the president's America First agenda, his confident pro-America rhetoric. It has been disparaged as darkly nationalistic and described using the pejorative alt-right label. In his recent speech in Poland, President Trump raised the achievements of the Polish people and proudly and unashamedly praised the West. If you missed that speech, I commend it to you. It was magnificent. Those who comment on national security policy quickly condemned his speech as having fascist undertones and that it was worrisome, nationalistic. One professor who teaches at the City University of New York called President Trump's concern for the survival of Western civilization, quote, perhaps the most shocking sentence in any presidential speech delivered on foreign soil in my lifetime. Speaking of Western civilization. To be considered a Western country, he continued, must be largely Christian, preferably Protestant or Catholic, and largely white. This is how he described the president's speech. Now, while confident patriotism is denigrated as dog whistles for the alt-right, those on the left with a distinct, truly anti-American sentiment are praised. The resistance, they call themselves, movement, and the Women's March, darling Linda Sarsour, recently exhorted fellow Muslims to, in her own words, wage jihad against the president. She also said, quote, "Our number one and top priority is to protect and defend our community. It is not to assimilate and please any other people and authority," end quote. Her message, one the left has embraced, is where identity politics reigns and where disgust for the country's past and current state prompts a visceral hatred and subsequent desire to act, to change the country, to change our country, and remake it into something very, very different than what I was learning about my freshman year in college. The survival of the American Republic, Alexander Hamilton asserted, depends upon, quote, "the preservation of a national spirit and a national character." Therefore, all of us who have locked arms with the mission and agree with the vision of the Centennial Institute have a great task before us. Take one of the aspects, I love this, of the Institute's vision on the website. It says, quote, "to impact our culture in support of traditional family values, sanctity of life, compassion for the poor, biblical view of human nature, limited government, personal freedom, free markets, natural law, original intent of the Constitution and Western civilization." Sounds pretty alt-right, Jeff. Let me try to explain why I think this mission is so timely. First, we have great external threats facing the United States, including radical Islamism. And please understand when I say that, I don't mean Islam. I don't mean Muslims. I'm talking about radical Islamism. That means those who believe in Islamism is you take the Muslim beliefs and you believe that it should be part of the law. So it's Sharia law. There's no separation between mosque and state. Islamism, it's political. It's a political ideology. And Islamism is neither strictly Shia or Sunni. It travels in the minds of individuals. It is exported along with mass migration, and it is funded by regimes controlling nation states like Iran. It is exported along, mass migration. We can see it in what has been called horrifically rape jihad, most notably in Afghan migrant populations in Europe, where sexual assaults take place brazenly and daily. I'm not even talking about terrorism. I'm just talking about what the Europeans are experiencing. But Islamist militantism isn't the only threat, of course. Communism and its sister socialism continue to prove themselves enemies of the dignity of human beings. In our lifetimes, we have watched Venezuela go from a prosperous nation to a barbarous one with the help of Cuba's Castro regime. As the nation continues to devolve, its leaders express their solidarity with the world's tyrants, including Syria's Bashar al-Assad. Assad is willing to use chemical weapons explicitly for the purpose of terrorizing his own people into submission. The elderly and children are especially targeted. That's what chemical weapons do. They really hurt the most vulnerable because they're indiscriminate. Not incidentally, but deliberately. This is the inherent purpose of chemical weapons. They are terror weapons. And Syria's patron, Iran, the world's leading sponsor of terrorism, with or without a deal, is committed to obtaining a nuclear missile that could reach the United States. It continues to wreak havoc across the Middle East and export and fund terrorism. If you have more questions about the Iran deal during the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about that then too. But I do want to focus now on North Korea. North Korea. You know, a lot of times you watch on TV and we talk about the threat from North Korea, but then I found that when I really asked people, you know, what do you know about the regime? Why is it so bad if North Korea has a missile that can reach Guam? Why is it so bad that the regime can hit the United States? Is it a rational regime? Is it irrational? What does it want? Well, let's talk about it. This is a regime so ghastly, its death camps are so vast, we can see them from space. Political prisoners are there. Children are there. Unimaginable sexual violence and torture at the hands of the government are in those prisons. A man so craven as to let his own people starve so that he can have a nuclear missile that can reach American cities, and he's close to having one proven now. We have watched over the last several decades the North Korean regime pursue both, there's always two parts to a nuclear weapons program, and you can't separate them. That's the actual delivery, that's the actual warhead, the payload, the nuclear piece. And then you have the delivery system. You cannot possibly deal with one without the other. This, by the way, I can't help myself, is one of the fatal flaws of the Iran deal, because it myopically handled just the nuclear piece and did not even deal with the missiles. Well, the nuclear piece is actually easier to get done. We've watched it with North Korea. They've had a nuclear weapon for many, many years. But what have they been doing recently? Testing missiles. And you know, a lot of times they'll test a missile, it'll blow up on the launch pad, and everybody out in Washington, D.C. says, see, North Korea is not really something to worry about because they can't get their missile program right. But what they've been doing is every time there is a failure, or if it doesn't go right, they learn from that mistake, they take that technology, they apply it to the next test, they move the system along. And as I said recently on TV, I said, it's like we've been watching North Korea develop this capability over the last several decades, like a train coming at us, and we've done nothing about it. And I like to, you know, I hit the Obama administration the hardest on this because they had the most recent opportunity to prevent it from happening. They had 8 years, and the Obama administration employed what they called strategic patience towards North Korea. That's a really fancy way of saying we looked the other way and dealt with these other things, and we didn't deal with North Korea. And so what we have seen then is just in President Trump's term, in July, 2 intercontinental ballistic missile tests that were successful. But anytime you see North Korea or Iran launch a satellite missile or a satellite launch, that is technology that can just be easily converted into a long-range, an intercontinental ballistic missile. So don't be fooled. This is not some innocuous, you know, civil space program. They're all not just interested in raising the next generation of astronauts. That's not what they're doing. They're testing their long-range missile program. And that's what North Korea has been doing. And then we also just recently saw North Korea, for the 6th time, explode a nuclear device, test a nuclear weapon. And so now, the only thing that we have not seen the North Koreans do is do what we call an end-to-end test. That's actually marrying the warhead, the payload, nuclear payload, with the ballistic missile, and to see that it can actually go up out of the atmosphere and re-enter the atmosphere. It's very, very difficult to do, but the last several, we call them combatant commanders that are in charge of watching this particular threat, Northern combatant commanders, have said that we believe, just based on the information we've seen them do, that if they really, really wanted to, they could put all of their technology together and could probably do it. And so we have to plan for that. So how far can they reach? A lot of people try to play down the threat like it's really not that bad. We thought, well, you know, it's going to come towards, you know, the United States. It'll just hit our lovely citizen friends in California, so maybe the rest of us don't have to worry about it. We do care about our fellow citizens in California, first of all, and we care about our fellow citizens in Guam, who are much, much closer to North Korea. But in fact, they've also shown that not only are they testing this missile capability, but they're also improving the delivery system so they're looking to put them on mobile systems. They can actually move it, send one off, and they can actually now, we believe, reach the Midwest, far east coast of the United States. Now, whether or not they're really good at putting it exactly where they want it, I hear a lot of people say, oh, but they can't actually put it in New York. Well, I don't care if it's in New York or a pasture in Kansas. If it hits the United States of America with a nuclear weapon, we got a major, major tragedy and catastrophe on our hands. So that's what we've seen with this regime, a regime with the character that is so, I try to tell people, they're not irrational. Do not think that they're irrational. It is a rational, evil regime that wants the United States of America out of the Korean Peninsula and out of that region of the world. That's what they want. Well, the United States happens to believe that we have freedom of the seas. There's international waters. We have trade and alliances with Japan and South Korea, and we're not going anywhere. So, how is President Trump doing? For years during the Obama administration, you know, some of us who work in the defense policy world started thinking, we kept watching this train coming down, and we thought, you know, could it possibly be the case that the Obama administration actually thinks maybe it's okay if North Korea has a nuclear ICBM? Because it was so puzzling. What else could it be that they're not taking a harder action towards the regime? And this was sort of, you know, something that we talked about, but it was only something we suspected. Well, we didn't have to suspect anymore, because on August 10th, 2017, Susan Rice wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. And she told us that history shows that we can, if we must, tolerate nuclear weapons in North Korea. She wrote it in the New York Times. So it's no longer a mystery. She was, you know, this was the Obama administration, at least Susan Rice, you know, believed that this was something that the United States could deal with. That kind of evil regime, a regime that does not respect the dignity of human beings, a regime that believes that it can coerce the United States of America with a nuclear ballistic missile. And by the way, the reason that these countries like Iran and North Korea focus so much of their resources on their missile program is because missiles are the most cost-effective way to challenge and blackmail and coerce such a mighty military as the United States of America. They're not going to have a Navy that can fight our Navy. They're not going to build an Air Force that can fight our Air Force, or an Army that can fight our Army. Well, they got a big Army, but they're not. It's never going to be as good as the one that the United States of America has. Ballistic missiles with a nuclear weapon can coerce and blackmail the United States of America, and that's why they want it. Well, I'd like to be clear on this point that the Pentagon, the current Pentagon, National Security Council, the State Department, the President of the United States understand that war on the Korean Peninsula would be tragic. Very, very, very bad. We have 28,500 American forces deployed there. That's just American forces. That's not even including all of the women and children and their families that live there as well. They're there to provide assurance to our ally, South Korea. And the South Koreans are just a couple of dozen miles away from the DMZ, where all of these conventional artillery is located in North Korea. The South Koreans are basically being held hostage today, right now, from a North Korea. But given the choice, President Trump has been very, very clear on this point. Given the choice between allowing the Kim regime to hold essentially a nuclear gun to the head of the American people or war on the Korean Peninsula, he's choosing the latter, okay? He's made that very, very clear. Now, a lot of people, as Jeff pointed out too, have been critical of President Trump's words, saying that we do have a viable military option against North Korea. Say something about that. President Obama said multiple times, all options are on the table. What was he talking about? A military option against North Korea. What's the difference between President Obama saying it and President Trump saying it? People believe Donald Trump, and it's making everyone nervous. But if we believe Donald Trump, do you know who else believes Donald Trump? North Korea. Kim Jong-un is worried, okay? And somebody said China. There's another myth a lot of people on the other side of the aisle like to say is all of this, all of this pressure on China, it's not going to work, it's not going to work. China doesn't actually have the ability to handle the North Koreans. The Chinese government provides more than 95% of North Korea's trade. It is the lifeblood of the North Korean regime. And when you hear people say, the more we sanction North Korea, the more we're going to hurt the North Korean people, sadly, the North Korean people are already suffering. The money that goes to the North Korean regime goes to funding the missile and nuclear programs to hold the United States at risk of nuclear attack, period. Okay? So the more we pressure the North Korean regime, the more we get China to cooperate with the United States. What does China not want? Ultimately, China doesn't want the United States to unify the Korean Peninsula. China doesn't want us in the region at all. China doesn't want us to have a great relationship with Japan. China doesn't want a bunch of North Korean migrants or refugees going into China if there's a war there. So China has a very serious stake in seeing this situation handle without a conflict. But again, China has also allowed Kim Jong-un, the Kim Jong-un dynasty, to misbehave the way it has because it can use it as leverage against the United States. But somebody got a little too far out ahead of himself, and so that's Kim Jong-un. And so now China is in the position of trying to figure out, is the American president serious, or is he bluffing like every other American president bluffed before him? So that's the challenge for Mr. Trump, is to convince Kim Jong-un and the Chinese that, oh no, I'm serious, and Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson and Ambassador Nikki Haley. Okay, so when you hear President Trump saying things that like, oh wow, that sounds very blunt, well, he's not speaking in nuanced terms to please the New York Times editorial board. He is speaking in a way to try to convince those in Pyongyang. And that is going to be the most effective way to deter war and preserve peace. And so when you hear people say that what the North Korean regime wants more than anything is regime survival, the way I explain it is, it isn't Kim's nuclear missile program that will ensure his regime's survival. Okay, right now he thinks it's a nuclear missile that's going to ensure his survival. Rather, it is meeting U.S. demands under President Trump that will ensure Kim's survival. And once Kim is convinced of this, then Secretary Tillerson can walk him through the next steps, but the channels will not be open forever, as the Secretary of State's spokesman recently said. And then I want to talk a little bit about the missile defense program and why this dovetails with it here. So while the Obama administration was employing this strategic patience against North Korea, it was doing something else. It was cutting U.S. missile defenses. So little history on this. President Bush withdrew the United States from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. That treaty prevented the United States from deploying and implementing a robust homeland missile defense system. Okay, he got us out of that after 9/11. And then the United States began getting really busy on trying to build a homeland missile defense system to protect the United States against, in particular, the kinds of missiles that North Korea or eventually Iran could threaten the United States with. It wasn't designed to handle the Russian threat or the Chinese threat. They've got much bigger missile arsenals. It was North Korea and then Iran. And so we were going as quickly as we can to get this system deployed and get it out there. So we've got missile interceptors, think of them as giant bullets, in Alaska, in Vandenberg Air Force Base out in California. We have the command and control center here in Colorado Springs. Soldiers right now watching the globe for missile launches and coordinating with and collaborating with those Fort Greely, Alaska, and Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. Keeping the country safe, that's what they're doing. When President Obama, when he was candidate Obama, he said, quote, I shouldn't say quote, because I don't have it in front of me, but he said something along the lines of, I don't agree with missile defense, okay? And this is the old sort of anti-Ronald Reagan missile defense thinking that building strong defenses would kick off an arms race and therefore it's destabilizing. Okay, well, I got news for those who still think that. The enemy has been building offensive capabilities, not only in spite of the fact that the United States wasn't building defenses, but because the United States wasn't building defenses. They've been exploiting those vulnerabilities. And so, so when President Obama entered the White House, he got a bunch of security briefings, and he realized, okay, wow, I guess our missile defense systems do work, and there's really bad guys that are launching missiles at us. So I'm not going to get rid of the whole missile defense system, but I am going to cut it in half. So that's what he did. He cut the ground-based mid-course defense system, that's the homeland missile defense system, in half. And then a couple years later, when North Korea started advancing its missile program, he realized that those 14 ground-based interceptors, those are the missile interceptors, the bullets that he cut from Fort Greely, Alaska, he realized that we probably do need those. So he made it his Secretary Hagel, I believe was Secretary of Defense at the time, announced that we would be expanding missile defense, 14 ground-based interceptors, and you got all these accolades for it, to which I said, they'd already be there if you hadn't cut them. So we've been playing catch-up ever since on missile defense. President Trump, in addition to employing what his administration is calling a pressure campaign against the United States, or against the North Koreans, we have this pressure campaign. Secretary Tillerson said a couple months ago that imagine the pressure campaign has a dial on it, a knob, and we had it at about a 5 or a 6 a couple months ago. Like, holy smokes, we're really putting the pressure on. We're only at a 5 or a 6. Yikes. There's a lot more we can still do, and more has been done since then. So we're going to continue exhausting all these other options we have before we get all the way down and before we understand that, you know, we've been given an ultimatum. But while he's been doing that, he's also been putting more money in our missile defense programs. So President Trump has, there's been a reprogramming request in Congress to get 20 more ground-based interceptors in Alaska. That's a lot. That's in addition to the 14 ground-based interceptors that President Obama had to put back, you know, to fund again after he cut them. And there's going to be more money for regional defenses abroad for South Korea and for Japan and for some of the stuff that we're doing in Eastern Europe. So there's going to be more missile defense there. And that is because President Trump, if you listen to what Secretary Mattis likes to say about the president, he says it multiple times. What is the one characteristic that Mattis seems to really appreciate in a commander-in-chief? Because remember, Mattis served President Obama as well. And President Obama fired General Mattis because General Mattis kept going to him and trying to make recommendations, and there was just it wasn't working out, and then General Mattis entered retirement early. But what is it about Trump that Mattis likes so much? He's persuadable. And so many people in Washington, D.C. look at that as a negative thing. I'll tell you what, it is not a negative thing. You can kind of a guy that comes in who's spent his whole entire career in the private sector, and some of this stuff he doesn't know. He doesn't know about the long history of missile defense or the nuclear triad, and a lot of people hit him about that, hit him for not knowing, what he should have known as a guy who's been a very successful businessman. Well, he goes in there and he intuitively gets it. He can be persuaded of these things. Missile defense makes sense to Donald Trump, as it should. And so now we are spending a lot more money on our missile defense systems. Okay, so we've covered a lot of North Korea, a little bit of Iran, Syria, and ISIS. All of these problems run through Russia. The Putin regime has sought to undermine U.S. efforts for peace and stability in nearly every area. It blocks efforts to punish North Korea and Iran. It props up Iran and Assad. It threatens sovereign nations that want to live and thrive, like Poland and Ukraine. And it has the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet, and oh, by the way, it isn't afraid to threaten us with them. A lot of people forget President Trump, Russia, Russia, Russia. Everyone loves to hit President Trump because he doesn't want to use this tough rhetoric with the Russians. And I like to remind people, it was the Obama administration's policy to appease and capitulate to the Russian Federation for 8 years, and we are paying a price for that now. You want to fault somebody for an emboldened Russian Federation? Do not look in the current White House. That was the last one. So I haven't even talked about China and its power grabs in international waters, its enabling of North Korea, its opposition to efforts that would strengthen the U.S.-Japan, U.S.-South Korean alliances. I could go on. But we have other threats at home. And if we don't win the day with our ideas here at home, we can't possibly balance and implement an effective and realistic strategies for handling all of the external threats facing the United States of America. There are ideas that would hobble our nation's ability to deter mass war, to fight when we must, and to end conflicts on terms most favorable to the United States of America. These ideas range from ones that would overextend our military, overpromise on what we can actually accomplish with countries with dictators, ideas that seek to hamstring our military, and ideas that naively place far too much confidence in the effectiveness of arms control treaties. The previous administration believed that treaties and agreements were good in and of themselves, rather than tools in our great toolbox we have to actually implement American policy. A bad deal is not good simply because it's a deal. It's a bad deal. It's much better for the United States to walk away from a bad deal than it is for the United States to accept the deal that's bad. So, what is it in the United States then that I see a sort of, I wouldn't call it a crisis, but there is turmoil in the conservative sort of intellectual life right now. Okay, and this is what I'm seeing out here. And you all might be readers or former readers of the Weekly Standard, the National Review, the Federalist, all of these conservative, great publications. I mean, nobody can agree on what we even think about what the goal is for the United States. Is President Trump, what he's doing, good or bad? Is nationalism even good or bad? What does the country mean? All of these things are sort of confusing the conservative intellectual life. And we've seen it, I would argue, also with Christian intellectualism. The political left has sought to co-opt Christian thought in domestic affairs to view the scriptures much like it views the Constitution, living document, whose meaning must be adapted and amended as history unfolds. It's also co-opting Christian thought, international relations, and national security, even in traditionally conservative Christian denominations. This is why you have so much confusion over what to do about immigration. Is saying that the United States of America must have control of its borders something that is incompatible with Judeo-Christian thought? I would say it is not. But this is something that is not so clear anymore. But Christianity has a long legacy of great minds who toiled to understand Scripture and Christian orthodoxy and applied them in ways to navigate matters of politics and international relations. So we have got to get back at this. Okay, this is something that I've seen, and this is the Trump administration has brought all of this and laid it all out for us to see. And that's why what we're doing here is so critically important, because we have to raise the next generation of thinkers to think seriously, to challenge what they're being told, to understand what our heritage means, to understand what it means to be an American. And I would say there is this strand that sort of runs through American intellectual life that is slightly anti-American. And we started with this a little bit, talking about this, that this sort of this patriotism that we're seeing, that people are squeamish about, it makes them uncomfortable. There seems to be an inability among many to just praise our heritage without also including her past and ongoing problems. Do you know what I mean? We just had it, you know, we celebrate a national holiday and everyone's like, oh, the country's so great. But, and then and everyone feels like we also have to say something that's negative about it. Imagine if we talked about our spouses that way. You know, my husband is so great. He faithfully cares for us so well. He never puts his socks in the hamper, though. You know, it's just you can praise the defining characteristics of that which is good without also feeling the need to say that which is bad. God has given Americans an enormous gift in the United States of America. Our nation was founded by men and women who recognize that God gives human beings rights, that the government is only there to protect those rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and that this experiment of self-government relies not on the whims of thugs, but the rule of law. Our history is one we can be proud of. Yes, we are, in fact, a creedal nation. That is, a nation of people from all walks of life, ethnicities, men, women, different faiths, who disagree on many, many things, but we agree on this, that the United States of America as a government is of the people, by the people, for the people, whose just powers are derived from the consent of the governed a democracy and a republic, a sovereign nation of many sovereign states, a perfect union, one and inseparable, established upon those principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity for which American patriots sacrificed their lives and fortunes. That was written in 1917. It was accepted by the United States House of Representatives on April 3rd, 1918, as the American Creed. Has our nation fallen short? Yes. No one is saying that it hasn't. For instance, slavery. The people with the power looked upon our enslaved brethren and ended the scourge of slavery. Though it was and is a global institution, always has been and persists in faraway lands, we fought a bloody, bloody war here for emancipation. Our country is one in which we all, including men who first held power, looked upon American women with dignity and respect, image bearers of God, equal in value and in dignity and worth, and to this day, we encourage and extol the virtues and unique contributions of American women and are committed that we, women, have equal protection under the law. That is a remarkable achievement. That is something we can be excited about. It is up to us, ladies, young ladies in the room, I try to remind you all here, to determine how, it's up to us to determine how we use our time and opportunities. And you can spend them complaining about the things you don't have or how things are really hard, or you cannot listen to those who do that, and you can enjoy the freedoms and opportunities and God-given talents and opportunities that you have and spend as your conscience dictates. At no but time in world history has it been a better time to be a woman than an American woman here in the United States of America. And perhaps most precious to the Christian, our nation is committed to ensuring that, as Attorney General Jeff Sessions recently said, the government does not come between God and man. All of these blessed, remarkable phenomena exist because of generations of American Christians, heroic, intellectual heavy lifting, not just Christians, but Americans in the Judeo-Christian tradition, from their heartfelt convictions, physical work, real blood and toil, sacrifice of Americans to protect our country that is, yes, a creedal nation, but one with actual land, actual physical borders. We are not merely a nation of ideas, though we are that. We are an actual nation state that we have to protect. These concepts are challenging American conservatives today. Now, this independent, spirited president that we have and his administration have come at a time when these concepts are being rediscovered and debated. What is America? How do we preserve her? How do we rediscover and appreciate and protect her? We are, I'm happy to report, crushing ISIS in Iraq and Syria right now. You won't have an American media that's there touting all of these accomplishments, but I'm telling you, we're doing it. We are strengthening our alliances. President Trump got so much grief over going and talking about how our NATO allies need to start contributing more to collective defense. Made everybody really uncomfortable. He's going to undo all of this hard work we've done to create this alliance. What has happened since he did that? The NATO alliance is getting stronger. We have countries that have had such a hard time coming up with their 2% obligations that are now contributing. Okay, so now the NATO alliance was never supposed to be just a gravy train for allies that didn't want to pay for their militaries. That was never its intent. It is a political alliance as well as a military alliance. That means it should come alongside the United States of America and share our values in the region. Yes, each country should stand up for itself. Each one is a sovereign nation, but that is the purpose of the alliance. And we are seeking to control the flow of immigrants who do not have the will to become Americans. And we're trying to sift through those, and the ones that do want to be Americans, we're trying to discern between those much more effectively than we have ever done in previous years. That's not entirely true. We were really good at it at the beginning of our country, at the founding of our country. You always hear that we're a nation of immigrants. Yes, we are. But even the founding fathers understood that you had to have a common national identity, even among a diverse group of people, that was incredibly important to the survival of the country. And we are finally pressuring China and forcing Kim Jong-un to relinquish his plan to threaten Americans with nuclear holocaust. We are working to prevent Iran now from going down the same path as North Korea. There is good work being done to reassert America as an independent, sovereign nation, and there is much more work to do. As I started saying, we have inherited an exceptional nation. The threats against her are real, and they are many, but let us continue our work to protect her. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're going to have some time for some questions, so raise your hand, and the dashing Justin Short will answer some questions.
I didn't say anything controversial, so nobody should have any questions for me.
I do want to. I think I want to sum it up, though. So stopping North Korea. If you had two answers for that, one was convince Kim Jong-un that if he wants to keep his regime survival, I think you called it regime survival, keep that. The best way is not to have a nuclear weapon and to work with the United States.
I would actually put a fine point on that. What the thing that we cannot tolerate? This is Rebecca's words, not the president. He hasn't said this explicitly. Is a nuclear weapon that can actually hit reliably the United States of America. That is absolutely intolerable, and we're not going to allow it. So the best way you can do that, he thinks that he needs that for regime survival. What I would argue is what the administration understands is trying to convince him that what he actually needs to survive is to relinquish that capability, to stop that capability. And then two, the other piece of the North Korean strategy is to build a secure and reliable defensive capability to provide protection of the American people against ballistic missiles. We're going to handle this threat now, but I promise you this ballistic missile threat is not going anywhere. And so we have got to get it out of our systems and out of our heads that building defenses is actually destabilizing. In fact, the opposite is true. So,
great. All right, questions. Justin, okay, go ahead. Yes.
I just have a question. You talked about the missile defense and intercontinental missiles and things, but and maybe this isn't your area, but I find that Americans in general hardly ever think about our Navy and how we have protected the commerce of the world for decades now, and I guess Obama has cut the Navy as well. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how important that is, that South China Sea with China trying to control that. But I mean, is America really that important to the world and the economy of the world because of our Navy?
That's a great question. No, I love it. I love it whenever I hear young fiscal conservatives say, you know, we spend a lot on national security, a lot on defense. I really wish we would just focus on the economy. To which I say, what do you think is actually enabling and protecting the economy? How do you think these packages are being shipped? It's the seas. It's the U.S. Navy. It's not just the Navy that has suffered under the last administration. The entire military has seen massive cuts. Not to get too wonky here, but there's this thing called sequester. And the idea here was that you pass this bill called the Budget Control Act, that what it would do is it would automatically just cut across the board the entire Defense Department, just cut it, and it wouldn't let us get above those levels. And the idea was it would be so drastic and so bad that it would force Congress to like figure out the budget, and everybody would avoid that from happening. Well, it just so happens that there's another political party that would like to see cuts in the Defense Department and fund other sort of pet issues in mandatory spending and entitlements. And so they let that Budget Control Act go through, and the president signed it into law. And so we have this here. So the Congress has been having multiple hearings on trying to figure out why all of these accidents, I'm sure you've seen with American ships where we've lost these sailors' lives. It's horrific. If you've spent any time at all actually understanding what happened in these particular situations, it's just almost unbearable for my mind to even meditate on these lives lost. It's so awful. It's so awful. And we've been having hearings about in Congress about what has caused a lot of this, and Secretary Mattis is implementing a review. But we suspect that a lot of it is because of these severe cuts in our military, that we've decreased training hours, and a lot of these major weapon systems are just, they're old, and they need to be refurbed, and then we have these lack of training hours. And so, no, it's terrible. And so, we've got to get to the point where there's only a couple of things the federal government is actually required to do. One of them is to provide for the common defense, okay? That's just a basic, fundamental thing we've all agreed to as citizens of this nation. So you got to get that right. I've argued that you got to prioritize that first. You got to get that right first before you think about spending money on other things. But it's a great question. It's critically important. Yes, the United States of America provides protection to make sure those sea lanes are open for commerce. And I don't see that going away as a mission anytime soon.
So far, I've never seen an article that I purchased that says made in Russia. I think Putin is, can you talk about him? I mean, doesn't the economy mean anything to him at all?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a complex, that's a whole nother lecture. Putin wants several things, okay? He wants several things. I'll just say this. I would just say that part of what he wants is he wants to extend Russian influence in Eastern Europe. And the Russian government has actually stated, this is not conspiracy theory stuff, this is just part of what the Russians have said, is that they view NATO as its geopolitical enemy, okay? And that's the United States. And so there's a lot of things that go on into that, including, just what Vladimir Putin is doing. A lot of it's propaganda in order to get his own people excited about his rule because they haven't been doing well economically, et cetera. And so there's lots of things going on. But that's part of what they're trying to do is extend their sphere of influence and push the United States out there. So does he want an economy? Does he want a good economy? I mean, I would say that, yeah, he wants it to be doing better, but is he to the point where he's willing to put aside all these other motives for the sake of the economy? I have not seen that. And I'll say something else too. If Vladimir Putin wanted somebody in the White House who would continue to try to bargain with him and capitulate to him, he would have wanted Secretary Clinton to be the next president of the United States. Nobody, or most people, didn't believe that President Trump, that Mr. Trump was going to be the next president of the United States. And so my sort of working theory about what we've seen in this last election is that the Russians are really working hard to try to leverage against what they saw as going to be the next president of the United States, and that was Hillary Clinton. But already under President Trump, he might not do a whole lot of talking about Vladimir Putin. Why is that? Because we're trying to do, we've got a lot to try to regain the strategic advantage in the world after the last 8 years in particular. And Russia's got its hands in just about everything. And so it looks like they're trying to take a tack where they're not overtly demeaning and embarrassing the Russians, but we are we're looking to get into the energy market so that all of our European allies aren't dependent on Russian energy. We are expanding our missile defenses that the Russians hate. We are trying to get peace again in Syria on our own terms that the Russians don't like. We are trying to actually corner Iran again so it doesn't become the great power that it's already down a path to become, which the Russians don't like. We are strengthening our alliance with the Poles, which the Russians don't like. Okay, we are revitalizing and modernizing our nuclear force, which the Russians don't like. So we're doing a whole lot of stuff that's good for the United States of America regardless of oppositions of the Russian Federation, and I think that's a good thing. We'll come to you next.
Good evening. Between World War I and World War II, there was a commentator in Baltimore called H.L. Mencken. And one of his famous quotes was, "The key to successful politics is to present an unending stream of hobgoblins, none of which are true." I ask, is anything that you have said tonight true? Let's go back to your World War I scenario. My father still in the 50s and the 60s suffered from what was the campaign against anybody and anything German. If anybody in the room wants to read about that era, the book by The book Illusion of Victory by Thomas Fleming is a wonderful read. And the United States government created a bureau to inform every newspaper what they should write on the war effort. Germans were lynched. German sympathizers were lynched because of the mobs that were left behind. And the 1917 Act of Sedition still is on the books and still can be used against any one of us. So I ask, why should the United States, why should we have our children and our wealth go to many, many foreign wars? Thank you.
Sir, I appreciate that sentiment very much. I'll say just a couple of different things. One, my last name is Heinrichs. And it's a name that I inherited through marriage. But without going into my own family heritage, on my husband's side, the original Heinrichses moved to Canada because they were fleeing persecution and mandatory participation in many of the wars in Germany, and so they went to Canada to get out of that. So anyway, we can go on. I am not in any way advocating for a sort of required line on American nationalism. I am a staunch proponent and defender of the First Amendment. And what I'm arguing for is we have strayed, even at that time, and again, I'm not saying that the United States hasn't committed wrongs that we shouldn't have done. We clearly have. But you can see how far we've come from there in terms of what it even means to be an American and what it even means to actually have some level of patriotism and attachment to our country and willingness to defend her. I mean, we are a long ways away from where we were in 1917. I mean, like I said, you can just look at what's happening right now in the NFL. But your point is taken, and then I would just argue that what I'm advocating for is an overall foreign policy that keeps the United States out of wars and preserves the peace. And the best way we do that is to have a strong military, a strong defense, and I understand that it's counterintuitive, but a will to use it if it means that we're going to protect American lives. It is only when the United States is unwilling to use it that we can see aggression popping up around the world. And we've got many, many different threats now, not just coming from one place, but from all over the place. So your point is taken. I fully understand what you're saying. But again, like I said, this sentiment that we had at the time I talked about 1917 was to rally a nation to fight a terrible and bloody, and I would argue, necessary war. And we were able to do it. And many of what we accomplished in the Second World War, we are still benefiting from the military force that the United States actually employed in World War II. So we're standing on the great feats of giants here when it comes to protecting the country.
My name is Haas. The last of my ancestors came over, skipped the country to avoid fighting the Franco-Prussian War. And if you look at the 20th century, the death toll of American interventionism is over 100 million innocent civilians. Thank you.
Next question.
Yes, sir. We wanted to get you up.
Do you think General Kelly will have more exposure before the press? I think he did a wonderful job the other day, as did President Trump today. And it shows that Trump has the capability to hire the right people with the experience base and to come across and boost his popularity.
I'll tell you what, General Kelly is about as good as an American as you can get. This is a man who, one thing I say, that what's more ultimate than giving your own life for your country? Giving your sons. And he is I've never met, it's hard to even think about how much this man and his wife have given to this country. And not only is he deeply patriotic, and I don't mean some cheap patriotism, I mean deeply understands what this country means, what she is, and that she's worth protecting and that she's worth sacrificing for. He's a great mind. He's a great strategist. He's a great political mind. And you've seen him in the press conference. I thought he did just wonderfully too in handling the media. And there's also this sort of myth that the media is painting that, you know, it's General Kelly and it's Mattis and it's McMaster and it's Tillerson and, you know, Nikki Haley that are keeping President Trump under control, you know, and nothing can be further from the truth from everything that I've seen. And I've talked with their staffs and I know what these meetings are like. President Trump, they all work for him and they can all be fired from him. And as we've seen, he's perfectly happy to let people go who aren't working out. So how do you know that the president is happy with General Kelly? He's got a job. So, no, I think he's wonderful, and I can't say enough wonderful things about him. So that's not to say that all of these guys agree with Mr. Trump. They have been, I mean, Mattis will say, I have disagreed with President Trump. And we've talked about these things. Mattis went into the president's office when he was interviewing the job as Secretary of Defense, and they went through the things that they disagreed with, and President Trump said, you're hired. So this is not a guy who is afraid to be challenged and to be persuaded. If you've got an argument, make your argument. But then on the other side of that, go back and if you look at these interviews that Secretary Mattis gave after he retired, he gave these great interviews about the civil-military, you know, relationship and how he understands them. What was the interview with? Pardon me? No, it was. I'll think of it after I leave here. But it's the guy. He's on Ricochet. What is the anyway? He talks about, though, he will give you his best arguments. He'll tell you when he thinks you're wrong behind closed doors, but he understands that the American people are the sovereign. They elect the president. He serves at the pleasure of the president, and he's going to carry that out. And so that's what he's doing. So I believe that the men that he has surrounded himself with, President Trump surrounded himself with, are implementing what the president's vision is and providing input to do it effectively. So that's what I see happening. I'll pick him. Okay. We will. I want to. Does anybody? We'll go. No. Okay. We'll go over here. Okay. Yes, sir. Let me hear.
Are you aware of any military options that the president can take against North Korea that, although risky, might not provoke the annihilation of Seoul?
Yeah, he said, I mean, are there actual credible military options the United States can employ that are not going to result in a retaliation that would annihilate Seoul, South Korea, the capital of South Korea? I am not privy to the conversations that are being had in classified settings. But every time Secretary Mattis has been asked, are there actual military options, he has said, yes. Now, I don't think that we're imminently about to do that. And there are some things that I'm sort of watching, you know, as I, but these bombers that were flying so far north of the DMZ, that's remarkable. These are nuclear-capable bombers. These are nuclear-capable fighters that were flying. And it is providing great reassurance to South Korea. Again, all of this is to deter war. You know, the president gets so much flack for being an aggressor. I thought it was remarkable. All these Hollywood, you know, the comedians were all saying, I saw one of them say, can we trade Kim Jong-un for Trump? Thinking that, I can't even tell you how disgusting that is. It's so, that is the most repressive, brutal regime on the planet, according to human rights groups. And what President Trump is trying to do is walk him back off of this nuclear missile capability. And, so my understanding is the answer to that question is yes. I just don't know what those are. It worries me, but because if we have to use force in North Korea, it's a lot of lives lost.
Okay.
Okay.
Jerry? How close
close do you work with Israeli Mossad? Because they have amazing capabilities that we don't seem to have. They can find things that we don't even know about right now, and they could really disable the whole system over there, and nobody would really know what happened.
So I like, so I don't work with the Mossad, but I will say I have worked with the Israelis in the past. You may have seen a lot of people when I talk about missile defense, people might not be too familiar with our own missile defense system, but they're very familiar with the Israelis' Iron Dome weapon system because they have figured out this really cool way to, there's simply too many missiles that can rain down on Israel for them to hit every one. But they've figured out how to look at, and they've got these algorithms, they've got to figure out a way to track the incoming missiles and only hit the ones that are headed towards population centers. It's remarkable. And they'll go ahead and just let the ones that aren't going to land in unpopulated areas. It's remarkable. Because what that does, not only does that provide defense against the Israeli people, but also lets the Israelis control the situation and decide what they want to do. It actually provides we lose less lives of the Palestinians when that happens, because if one of these weapons, one of these missiles did land on an Israeli population center, you know that there would be a major retaliation back. But these missile defense systems provide some breathing space to allow the Israelis to control the escalation control, the escalation ladder of this situation. It's remarkable technology. The United States works with the Israelis on some of our missile defense systems, including the Arrow weapon system. So, and we've worked with them on David Sling, another one of their missile defense systems. The reason that the Israelis, we say, how is it that the Israelis are able to figure out this technology? The nation of Israel is the size of New Jersey, and it's located in a really bad neighborhood. And the Israelis have got to figure out how to protect themselves. And there's nothing like living in an area where the Israelis live and with the size of New Jersey to make you really kind of come up with some good technological breakthroughs. So anytime there's an opportunity for the United States to work with what the Israelis are doing in technology, I am all for it. That is money well spent.
I got one more. Yeah, you got that.
What's the current state of protecting the grid from an EMP attack, which to me seems like the #1 issue that we need to protect against?
Great questions. There's a couple different ways to look at threats, because people say, what about this threat? What about this threat? And what about smuggling a dirty bomb? And what about, there is like all kinds of ways to harm the United States of America. And then there's the kinds of threats that are the most likely, and then there's the kinds of threats that would cause the most catastrophic damage. And you want to figure out, you want to handle the ones that are most likely, you want to defend against you have to prioritize. You have to figure out how to defend against these. And an electromagnetic pulse attack, for those of you who don't know, you can take a nuclear weapon and you shoot it up and you detonate it at apogee. It's the peak of the missile's trajectory. And then once you detonate this, you fry the grid. You can fry the grid. And the idea here is that, you think about what's happening in Puerto Rico right now. No power. And what effect that has, and how Americans are so reliant on the electric grid. Anywhere from our phones to communicating with our family, for the government to communicate with us, for rapid responders, so our hospitals, the military our military relies on satellites. It can, depending on where the EMP attack is, it can fry our satellite systems. And our military relies on those satellites to see what we're doing abroad. But the military is also completely reliant on the commercial grid, the electric grid. And so if you think of what happens if Iran can take a ship and get it close to the United States and launch an EMP attack near one of our coasts, or if North Korea can do that, it would be devastating. And it wouldn't cause loss of life necessarily right away, but it would be long. So a couple things. One, I would say that's not the most likely threat, because it's harder to do. It is a very serious one. It is a real one. General Hyten's commander of Strategic Command has said that this is a real threat. This is not something you just read on right-wing blogs. That's never going to happen. The North Koreans have said that that they're working on EMP. We've seen the North Korean or the Iranians launch a ballistic missile and try to detonate it up in the air, which why would you do that unless you're actually practicing launching an EMP attack? So these things are real. It's a real thing. But it's just really hard to do. It's much more likely that the North Koreans, once they figure out how to get a nuke on an ICBM, that they could just coerce and threaten the United States with it and just, like I said, launch it and land it in the United States on, territory. It's easier to do that than it is to loft and get it to detonate just right. So what are we doing? Well, we are behind, but we're working to harden the grid. And when I say working to harden the grid, what are we actually doing? The United States government is looking at how we can best do that. One of the biggest obstacles to doing that is you actually have to get electrical companies and private companies to work with the government to do it, and it's expensive to do.
I've heard from the real experts, it's like $2 to $3 billion, and it's not expensive.
So it depends on it depends on what you want to do. So if the US government was just going to do it, it's fine. I'm talking about it's expensive for companies to do it. If the government requires companies to actually harden their own systems, they don't want to do it. So you actually have to come up with legislation. My former boss, Congressman Franks from Arizona, has authored legislation to protect the grid. And so there's a couple ways you do it to harden the grid, to make sure that there's not just one single point failure, that it's robust enough so that if something goes down, then we have other options available that we can get it quickly back up. You also want to have defensive system, missile defense, that you can intercept the missile at its earlier trajectory before it gets to the mid-course phase of flight to detonate an EMP. There's an EMP commission that was there for a long time with great minds who have been trying to inform the government on what we can do. That has lapsed this year. I have argued that we need to fund, it doesn't cost much to even fund the EMP commission to tell us what we need to do and offer recommendations. So again, we got to get serious about it. It's a serious problem, but I'm hopeful that this administration is more serious about it and committed to rectifying the problem and the vulnerability and getting serious about it.
All right, can we give Rebeccah a round of applause? Thank you. She did a great job. Well done, Rebeccah. Thank you so much. A few upcoming events that I'd love to remind you about, make sure you know about. On November 8th here in the event center, we're going to host a big rally in support of Jack Phillips, the baker here in Lakewood, who is going to be before the U.S. Supreme Court here. We want to send him out. The argument was scheduled for December 5th, so about a little less than 1 month before. We want to show him how many people here in Colorado stand with Jack Phillips and the religious freedom that he's arguing so passionately for. That'll be November 8th, 10 a.m. in the event center, a nice big rally. Our next distinguished lecture series will be in December. We're going to host Dr. Carol Swain. She's a firecracker. She just Google later Dr. Carol Swain in Prager University. She's going to talk on race relations in America. Non-controversial topic here. So race relations in America, that'll be in December on December 4th, right back here in this room likely. So thank you again for coming out and your support of the Centennial Institute. Have a great week. God bless you.